Dante Alighieri is renowned as a preeminent poet in global literature, particularly for his monumental work, The Divine Comedy, a groundbreaking masterpiece which revolutionized the utilization of the Italian language in literary works, presents an expedition through the domains of Inferno, Purgatorio, and finally Paradiso, under the guidance of the Roman poet Virgil, and Dante's source of inspiration, Beatrice. In addition to its exceptional literary brilliance, the Divine Comedy provides a vivid depiction of medieval society and had a profound impact on religious and philosophical thinking of the time. But Dante's life was so much more. It was a life closely connected to the political upheaval of the era, resulting in his banishment from the great city of Florence in 1302 due to conflicts arising from the Guelph and Ghibelline rivalry, which greatly influenced his literary works, of course. He also spent his last years in different Italian courts, where he finished his epic work, and also wrote La Vita Nuova, a collection that expresses his deep affection for his Beatrice. He died in 1321 in Ravenna, leaving behind a celebrated legacy known for its humanism, intricacy, and significant impact on the evolution of Western literature. I will assume that you've read The Divine Comedy. If not, that's okay. I do advise that you do. But we're going to be talking about the man behind the work today. A biography, all about Dante Alighieri. But first, let me, as is customary, welcome you to the channel. For the newcomers, it's good to meet you, and those returning, great to have you with me again. Now, we are on Facebook now, so if you want to talk on Facebook and get involved with the community, well, go ahead and search me up. You'll find me. Also, if you want to support the channel, just click the like and subscribe. That always helps. Well, let's all just get nice and relaxed first. And let's discuss the topic for today, the life of Dante Alighieri. We go back to Florence, where Dante was born, which was part of the Republic of Florence at the time in what is now known as Italy. Of course, Italy as a country did not really exist as it does in our modern sense then. Now, in terms of the precise date of when Dante was born, that is a little uncertain, although it's estimated to be about in the May of 1265, though this is yet to be completely confirmed. But we can infer this from the autobiographical references in the Divine Comedy. You see, the first section of Dante's work, the Inferno, starts with the line, "midway upon the journey of my life," suggesting that Dante was approximately 35 years old, and this estimation is based on the biblical reference in Psalm 89:10, which states that the average lifespan is 70 years. So that's where we get that midway on our journey of life from. Well, considering that Dante's fictional journey to the netherworld occurred in the year 1300, it can be inferred that he was likely born around 1265, and according to some verses in the Paradiso section of the Divine Comedy, there is a suggestion that the author was born under the astrological sign of Gemini. So, in these verses, the author describes observing the eternal twins and witnessing a threshing floor that incites our ferocity, which can be seen as a reference to the characteristics associated with the sign of Gemini. Now, the specific verses 22, 151 to 154, the sun was positioned in the zodiac sign of Gemini from around May 11th to June the 11th in the year 1265. And of course, Dante, like many of the other poets at the time, were quite fascinated with the world that came before them, that golden age of Roman power. So, he was not shy about asserting that his lineage traced back to the ancient Romans. However, the earliest known ancestor he could identify was his great-great-grandfather, Guida de Alice, who was born around 1100 or perhaps a little later. Well, Dante's paternal parentage consisted of Alighieri de Bellinzione, a prominent entrepreneur, but also a usurer. That basically means you lend money out at interest. Generally a frowned-upon practice at the time, that's for sure. While his maternal lineage can be traced to Bella, plausibly affiliated with the esteemed Abati lineage, a notable Florentine dynasty. But she had passed away when Dante was still quite young. In fact, he was less than 10 years old. Alighieri then entered into another marriage with one Lapa di Chiarissimo Chialuffi, and I'll do my best with the Italian pronunciations, by the way. Well, the veracity of their marriage remains disputed due to the societal constraints imposed on widowers. It wasn't so easy back then. However, it is undeniable that she gave birth to 2 children from their union. Now that is Dante's half-brother, Francesco, and also his half-sister, Tana, also known as Gaetana. Now in general, in the era of Dante, the majority of city-states in northern Italy were divided into 2 political factions, kind of a red team and a blue team. There was the Guelphs, who backed the papacy, and the Ghibellines, who supported the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire was effectively, well, we can boil it down to the Germans. The Guelphs had the loyalty of Dante's family, but the Ghibellines seized control of Florence with the Battle of Montaperti in 1260, resulting in the expulsion of numerous Guelphs. Despite Dante's family being a part of that faction, they did not face any retaliations after the fight, and this was likely due to the lack of influence that Alighieri carried in the public sphere. Certainly a good time to keep your head down. Well, in 1266, the Guelphs engaged in another conflict with the Ghibellines at the Battle of Benevento, successfully reclaiming Florence from their control, albeit the city was a little bit battered up. When Dante recounted his initial encounter with Beatrice Portinari, the child of Folco Portinari, stating that he encountered her for the first time at the age of 9 years old, and at that time she was 8 years old. He professed to have experienced an immediate love for her, purportedly without engaging in any form of spoken communication. At the age of 12 years old, he was, however, betrothed to Gemma di Manetto Donati, the daughter of Manetto Donati, a prominent member of the influential Donati family. You see, arranging marriages for children at a young age was, well, it was pretty prevalent back then. It was a practice that also entailed a formal ceremony complete with contracts that were signed in the presence of a notary. More about legal obligations rather than any real emotion. Well, after reaching the age of 18, Dante asserted that he frequently encountered Beatrice once more, exchanging pleasantries and with her while crossing paths in the streets of Florence. However, it is important to note that Dante did not have a deep acquaintance with her. Well, following his marriage to Gemma, he asserts that he encountered Beatrice again. He composed numerous sonnets dedicated to her. However, he never made any reference to Gemma in any of his poetic works. Kind of feel sorry for her, don't you? Well, in his Divine Comedy, Dante alludes to various members of the Donati family, including Forese and Picarda. The precise year of his marriage remains a little unknown too, but it is evident that before to his exile in 1301, he had fathered 3 children with Gemma, that being Antonia, Jacopo, and Pietro. When Dante was in combat alongside the Guelph cavalry during the Battle of Campaldino on June the 11th, 1289, and they won. In fact, the triumph led to a restructuring of the Florentine constitution. In order to participate in civic affairs, individuals were required to join one of the numerous trade associations or professional guilds in the city. Consequently, Dante chose to become a member of the Physicians, or as they called it, Apothecaries Guild. Well, occasionally his name is documented as actively participating in the deliberations or casting votes in the Republic's councils. Several minutes from the meetings held between 1298 and 1300 have unfortunately been misplaced, and we're yet to find them. Maybe they're in some old archive, or the Vatican's hiding them from us for some silly reason, I don't know. But either way, it makes it difficult to determine the exact extent of his involvement. Oh, and don't be too surprised what the Vatican's actually got in the archives. They have a very large collection of questionable materials. It's very hard to get in there. But they certainly like collecting. And hey, I like collecting too, so I can't blame them too much. But not the kind of things that they collect. Well, little information is also available regarding Dante's education. It is believed that he either received instruction at his residence, or perhaps at a school that was affiliated with a church or a monastery in Florence. He is, however, recognized for his study of Tuscan poetry and his admiration for the works of the Bolognese poet Guido Ghinzelli. Now, in Purgatorio 16, he referred to Ghinzelli as his father, so they were certainly quite close. Now, this occurred during a period when the cultural group known as the Sicilian School was gaining traction in Tuscany, and with traction comes power. In addition, he encountered the Provençal poetry of the troubadours, such as Arnaud Daniel, as well as the works of Latin writers from classical antiquity, beginning his fascination, notably with Cicero, Ovid, and particularly Virgil. His relations with Beatrice exemplify this concept of courtly love and affection, a phenomenon that originated in French and Provençal poetry of earlier ages. Dante's encounter with such love was characteristic, yet his articulation of it was unparalleled. His impact on the dolce still nuova, a word he himself defined, was driven by his love. Alongside other poets and writers of his time, Dante delved into unexplored dimensions of this amore, as they say in Italian, amor in French. You know the song? That's amore. Well, that's what it is. It's love. And of course, this love and affection for Beatrice served as his primary motivation for producing poetry. And, well, his primary motivation for existing at all. She is portrayed as semi-divine in numerous poems, continuously observing and offering spiritual guidance, a guardian angel, although occasionally in quite a stern manner. After the death of Beatrice in 1290, Dante found solace in Latin literature. He was also a big fan of the works of Thomas Aquinas, or should I say Saint Thomas Aquinas? I suppose I should. Now, to rewind a little bit, when Dante was about 18 years old, he encountered Guido Cavalcanti, Lapo Gianni Sina da Pistoia, and shortly thereafter Brunetto Latini. They collectively emerged as the prominent figures of the Dolce Stil Nuovo movement. You see, Brunetto was subsequently acknowledged in the Divine Comedy for the knowledge he imparted to Dante. But of course, it wasn't all hanging around with your friends and having fun, writing poetry and all the rest. Dante, like pretty much everybody else in Florence at the time, was deeply involved in that war between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. And yes, he participated in the Battle of Campaldino on June the 11th, 1289, fighting on the side of the Florentine Guelphs against the Arezzo Ghibellines. He served as a feditore, leading the initial assault, and quite bravely at that. Well, following their victory over the Ghibellines, the Guelphs split into two groups. First, there was the White Guelphs, headed up by Vieri de' Cerchi, and representing Dante's party. And then there was the Black Guelphs, led by Corso Donati. Well, initially the division occurred inside the family, but later on, ideological disagreements emerged due to contrasting perspectives on papal influence in Florentine matters. The Black Guelphs were in favor of the Pope's authority, while the White Guelphs desired greater autonomy from Rome. And the Whites assumed control initially and forcibly removed the other half. Pope Boniface devised a strategy to militarily seize control of Florence. Charles of Valois, the sibling of King Philip IV of France, was anticipated to travel to Florence in 1301. This voyage was prompted by the Pope's appointment of Charles as a mediator to establish peace in Tuscany. However, the municipal administration had previously mistreated the Pope's envoys a few weeks ago, as they were striving for autonomy from the influence of the papacy. And the Pope doesn't like it when you mistreat his envoys. Due to suspicions that Charles had been given additional unofficial directives, the council dispatched a delegation, which included Dante, all the way to Rome with the aim of convincing the Pope to refrain from sending Charles to Florence. Now you see, remember when we mentioned that he was in that guild of physicians and apothecaries? Well, by virtue of this guild membership, he was granted the privilege of holding public office in Florence, and as a politician he occupied multiple positions over several years in a city characterized by its political turmoil. So when the time came to send their little delegation to Rome, well, Dante was the perfect guy to send with them. Join the party. Now as for Pope Boniface, he expeditiously dismissed the other delegates, and he requested Dante alone to stay in Rome. Don't worry, it's not what you think. Well, simultaneously, on the 1st of November 1301, Charles of Valois arrived in Florence, accompanied by the Black Guelphs. Well, within the following 6 days, they inflicted significant damage upon the city and caused the demise of numerous adversaries. A fresh administration of Black Guelphs was established, and Cante de Gabriele de Gubbio was designated as the podesta of the city. Dante, who, remember, was affiliated with the White Guelphs, was sentenced to a 2-year exile in the March of 1302. Additionally, he was also charged with a substantial fee, along with the Gherardini family. Gherardini, rather, do apologize. Now, Dante had faced allegations of corruption and financial misconduct from the Black Guelphs during his 2-month tenure as the prior of Florence, the city's highest office. This was all accused of him doing this in 1300. So, in 1302, Dante remained in Rome because the Pope, who had supported the Black Guelphs, strongly advised him to do so. Well, due to his association with the Black Guelphs, Florence saw Dante as a fugitive. Talk about a rock and a hard place. Poor guy. Well, as for that fine, Dante was not about to just pay that. Of course, if he did pay it, I suppose it'd make him look like he was admitting guilt. So he simply refused due to his conviction of innocence, and also the fact that his assets in Florence had been confiscated by the Black Guelphs. So first they take all of his money, all of his property in Florence, and then they charge him a ridiculous fine, telling him he has to pay it with the money they've just stolen from him. You can tell the Black Guelphs are not really the best people to have around. Well, he was sentenced to permanent banishment. Of course, if he had come back to Florence without settling the fine, he could have even faced execution, and not a good one either. They were going to burn him at the stake. Now, I don't know how they arrived at such a gruesome method, but they certainly did not like him. As a matter of fact, you'd be surprised to know that it took until the year 2008 for the municipal court of Florence to revoke Dante's sentence, which had been imposed upon him almost 7 centuries later. 2008, my goodness. Well, Dante stayed with Moroello Malaspina in the Lunigiana region between the years 1306 and 1307. Now, Dante participated in multiple endeavors led by the White Guelphs to reclaim authority, although these endeavors were unsuccessful as a result of betrayal. You see, consumed by resentment towards his adversaries, he became repulsed by the internal conflicts and inefficiency of his erstwhile comrades. and made a solemn commitment to stand firmly on his own. Thus he travelled to Verona as an invitee of Bartolomeo I della Scala, and thereafter relocated to Sarzana in Liguria. Subsequently, it's believed that he resided in Lucca beside a woman by the name of Gentuca. Now, she evidently ensured his stay was pleasant, and he subsequently expressed his gratitude for her in Purgatorio. There are also some unreliable sources that suggest that he travelled to Paris from 1308 to 1310, and even less reliable sources claim that he found himself travelling to Oxford. Of course, these claims were initially made in Boccaccio's book on Dante many years later after his death, and they appear to be influenced by readers who were impressed by the poet's extensive knowledge and scholarship. Clearly, Dante's mastery of philosophy and his literary pursuits grew during his exile, where he was no longer occupied with the daily affairs of all of those unpleasant political things. You couldn't pay me enough to be a politician. Well, this is apparent in his written works during the time, as he certainly expresses it openly. But there is a lack of concrete proof to support the claim that he departed from Italy completely. Dante's letter to Henry VII of Luxembourg affirms his residency in April of 1311, specifically stating that he was living below the springs of Arno, near Tuscany, and of course Tuscany is well and truly within Italy. And now in 1310, when Emperor Henry VII of Luxembourg leads a military expedition into Italy with a force of 5,000 soldiers. Not good news, bad time to be an Italian. Well, Dante perceived in him a potential leader akin to Charlemagne, who would revive the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor and reclaim Florence from the Black Guelphs. Thus he corresponded with Henry and multiple Italian rulers, issuing a demand for the annihilation of the Black Guelph party. By blending religious beliefs with personal matters in his works, he provoked a divine wrath against his city and identified specific individuals who were also his personal adversaries as potential targets. Of course, during this period he also authored De Monarchia, advocating for a global monarchy, led by Henry VII himself. So you can see how much Dante liked him. Oh, and yes, as we had mentioned, the individuals who ended up in Dante's writings in rather unfavorable positions, well, that was pretty common. If you look through Inferno, you'll find a few of Dante's, well, the people that he did not really like very much in rather horrible circumstance. At some indeterminate moment during his period of banishment, he formulated the concept of the comedy, although the exact date remains obscure. The work demonstrates a higher level of confidence and is of greater magnitude compared to anything he had produced in Florence. Of course, it's the most famous of all of his works. I mean, no one's really talking about De Monarchia. Well, except for us, just then. But that doesn't count. Well, it is probable that he would have only embarked on such a project after realizing that his political aspirations, which had been of the most importance to him, at least until his exile, had been indefinitely suspended. While it is evident that Beatrice's presence in his imagination had become stronger and more significant than it was in the Vita Nuova. In Convivio, written between 1304 and 07, Dante had stated that the memory of his childhood romance was simply a thing of the past. Well, a preliminary sign that the poem had begun is a notification by Francesco de Barberino, inserted into his work The Lessons of Love, most likely composed in 1314 or early 1315. Francesco observes that Dante utilized the Aeneid as a model for his poem titled Comedy, with the location of this work or portion of it being the Underworld, namely hell. The concise letter does not provide any undeniable evidence that Barberino had seen or read the Inferno, or that this particular part of the poem had been published at the time. However, it does suggest that the composition was well in progress, and the initial outlining of the poem may have commenced some years earlier. The illuminations of Francesco de Barberino's earlier Officolium manuscript, 1305–08, which was discovered as early as, as late, as 2003, are believed to have been strongly influenced by Dante's work. The publication of the Inferno by 1317 is confirmed by quoted lines found in the margins of current dated records from Bologna. However, it is uncertain if the three parts of the poem, being Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, were published in their entirety, or if only a few cantos were released at a time. Canto being kind of like chapters. Well, it's basically a chapter. Now, it seems probable that Paradiso was completed prior to his death, but there is possibility that it was published after his death. Now, back to 1312, with Henry, who launched an attack on Florence and emerged victorious against the Black Guelphs, just according to plan. However, there is no substantiated proof of Dante's involvement in this event. There are conflicting accounts on his involvement, however, in the attack on his city by a foreigner. Now, some claim that he declined to take part, while others propose that he had also fallen out of favor with the White Guelphs, and any evidence of his presence was deliberately erased. Perhaps so. Either way, Henry VII was not around for too long to celebrate. He passed away in the following year, due to an illness that's not quite specified, extinguishing any possibility for Dante to return to Florence and have any semblance of normality. So, he decided to go back to Verona, where Can Grande della Scala granted him in a secure circumstance of living and probably a considerable level of prosperity. Can Grande was granted access to Dante's paradise in Paradiso, so you could tell he was a very good friend, literally writing him into the pages of heaven. While in exile, Dante engaged in correspondence with Friar Nicholas Brunacci, 1240–1322, a Dominican theologian who had studied under Thomas Aquinas at the Santa Sabina Studium in Rome, and later Paris, as well as under Albert the Great at the Cologne Studium. Now, Brunacci was appointed as a lector at the Santa Sabina Studium, which, by the way, was the precursor to the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. The more you know. Well, he subsequently worked in the papal curia. Not a bad job, little dry though. Uguccione della Fagiuola, it's a hard name to say, the military commander in authority of Florence, compelled the city to bestow amnesty upon its exiled citizens. And of course, Dante was one of them. This all happened in the year 1315. However, in order to make amends, Florence demanded that the individual publicly acknowledge their wrongdoing, and also pay a substantial punishment. Whatever punishment that would be and how substantial it was, that was not yet decided. Doesn't sound like a good deal. A little too risky. Well, Dante wasn't an idiot, so he declined, and he opted to simply stay in exile. After Uguccione's victory against Florence, Dante's death penalty was changed to house detention, with the stipulation that he had to travel to Florence and pledge to never enter the city again. He declined, and his capital punishment was validated and prolonged to his children. Nevertheless, even in his later years, he had a hopeful desire to be invited back to Florence under more dignified circumstance, namely to get recognition for his poems, and of course there's no place like home. Well, Dante's last moments were occupied at Ravenna, where he had received an invitation to reside in the city in 1318 from its ruler, Guida de Polenta. Dante passed away in this very city of Ravenna, September the 14th, 1321. He was 56 years old. Reportedly it was due to quartan malaria that he had contracted during his return from a diplomatic mission to the Republic of Venice. He was accompanied by his 3 children, and potentially Gemma Donati. Remember the Donati family? Oh yes. As well as acquaintances and supporters he had in the city. He was interred in Ravenna at the church of San Pier Maggiore, subsequently known today as Basilica di San Francesco. Now, later on, in 1483, Bernardo Bembo, the Praetor of Venice, also constructed a tomb in his honor. And a little closer, 1329, Bertrand de Bourget, a cardinal and a nephew of Pope John XXII, deemed Dante's Monarchia, remember the one he wrote about Henry VII effectively ruling the entire world, as heretical, and attempted to dig up his remains and incinerate them on a pyre. Ostasio della Ponenta and Pino della Tosa, who were supporters of Bourget, intervened to prevent the annihilation of Dante's remains. Well, Florence ultimately experienced remorse over banishing Dante. The city issued multiple requests for the repatriation of his remains. The custodians in Ravenna adamantly declined, even resorting to concealing the bones under a deceptive wall of the monastery. But in 1829, Florence constructed a mausoleum for Dante at the Basilica of Santa Croce. Since then, the grave has remained vacant, while Dante's body has remained in Ravenna. The inscription in the front of his tomb in Florence, which can be loosely translated as "Honor the most exalted poet," just shows how much they respected him, although it came a little bit too late from the people of Florence. Would have been nice if they had have stuck up for him a little bit more while he was alive and banished. Well, that's how it always goes, isn't it? You don't know what you've got till it's gone. Now, in more modern times, there's a few developments. In 1945, the Italian government considered relocating Dante's remains to the Valtellina redoubt, an alpine valley intended for their final resistance, arguing that the supreme representation of Italian identity should be present during their last stand. But no action was taken. Either way, since 1911, a replica of Dante's purported death mask has been displayed in the Palazzo Vecchio, but historians believe that it is not authentic, likely sculpted much later in 1483 by Pietro and Tullio Lombardo. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote the first official biography of Dante around 1348, and despite some inaccuracies, while an earlier version was included in Giovanni's Villani Nova Cronica. In the 16th century, English Protestants like John Bale and John Fox, who by the right way wrote the Book of Martyrs, if you're interested in that kind of thing, viewed Dante as a precursor to Protestantism due to his opposition to the Pope. The 19th century saw a revival around Dante, part of the broader medieval revival within Romanticism, with figures like Thomas Carlyle, Leigh Hunt, Henry Wadsworth championing his work. Italy's first dreadnought battleship, which was completed in 1913, was also named Dante Alighieri. While the majority of Dante's literary work was written subsequent to his banishment in 1301, La Vita Nova, or The New Life, is the sole significant piece that precedes it. It comprises a compilation of lyric poetry, including sonnets and ballads, accompanied by prose commentary. The planned distribution of this work was in manuscript form, as was customary for such poems in the day. Now, furthermore, it includes, or at least creates, the narrative of his affection for Beatrice Portinari, who therefore after became the ultimate representation of deliverance in the Divine Comedy, a role that was originally hinted at in the last pages of the Vita Nova. The book includes a collection of Dante's love poems written in the Tuscan language. This was not uncommon, as the use of vernacular for lyrical works had been a frequent practice throughout the 13th century, but nevertheless Dante's analysis of his own work is also presented in the vernacular tongue, as seen in both the Vita Nova and Convivio, rather than the often employed Latin. Of course, the Divine Comedy, being his most famous work, recounts Dante's own odyssey through the realms of hell, purgatory, and paradise. Initially, he is accompanied by the esteemed Roman poet Virgil, but later he is joined by Beatrice too. Among these three books, Purgatorio is undoubtedly the most lyrical, making references to a greater number of contemporary poets and artists, at least compared to the Inferno. But on the other hand, Paradiso is the most extensively theological, and according to many historians, it contains the Divine Comedy's most exquisite and mystical passages. Of course, most people just read Inferno, well, because it's the coolest. But you do owe it to yourself to read Purgatorio and Paradiso as well. If you want. Whatever, it's no pressure. But I would if I were you, if I was going to assign you any sort of homework. Well, of course, due to its profound purpose, elevated literary status, and the extensive variety of its content, both in terms of style and theme, the comedy quickly became a fundamental element in the development of Italian as a recognized literary language. Dante himself possessed a heightened awareness compared to other early Italian writers regarding the diverse Italian dialects and the necessity to establish a literature and a unified literary language that surpassed the constraints of Latin writing during that era. In this regard, he can be considered a precursor of the Renaissance, which aimed to produce vernacular literature that rivaled the works of earlier classical writers, as difficult as that would be. But they did a decent job of it. Well, Dante's profound understanding, within the constraints of his era at least, of Roman antiquity, and his clear appreciation for certain characteristics of pagan Rome, clearly foreshadowed the movements of the 15th century. Alright, and with that we get to the end of our life of Dante Alighieri. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. And the homework is set for you to go and read the Divine Comedy, or perhaps you can find a good audiobook of it. Oh, maybe I should be the one who makes that. Well, that's another job on the list, isn't it? Now I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters. It is Dark, Carrie, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, and Wendy. Lovely, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you for listening all of this way. Once again, it's been a pleasure to have you with me on this journey back in time, and I hope I'm going to see you again in the next video. But for now, let's all go and have a nice rest and meditate on what we've learned. I'll see you next time. Lots of love to you all. Good night.